Hey, welcome back. So as we continue down the path of validating desirability, we're going to start with the qualitative test first. Okay, so the first thing is follow-up interviews and then shopping cart. So we'll go through what that is. So follow-up interviews are all about following up with the initial users who you interviewed in the user research section. Okay, so each of those users introduced a problem that you could solve for. Okay, so if you've done some initial prioritization and ruled out a few of the problems that you could solve for ones that have higher chances or higher likelihood of helping you hit your goals, you don't need to go back to all the other users who stated other problems. You want to follow up with them and thank them for their time and be courteous and professional. But for this purpose, only follow up with the ones that have stated problems that you've done some level of prioritization for. Okay, so in those follow-up interviews, what you're trying to accomplish is a couple things. Those mock-ups, maybe even the diagrams, but more so the mock-ups that you've created, you want to put back in front of these interviewees, right? Say, okay, I heard your problem. Let me reiterate the problem that I heard from you. Make sure that is accurate. And then if it's not, well, then you need to go back to the drawing board. But if it is, and you did understand it and document it correctly, then show them the mock-up and say, this is how we're thinking about solving it. Does this look like it would solve your problem? Or does this sound like it would solve your problem from what you're seeing and what you're hearing? And if you're like, no, you're way off, well, that's good information. You haven't really done anything super time intensive, and you haven't taken weeks worth of development effort to be wrong. Okay, so that's why we do this, is to avoid the risk of developing and shipping the wrong stuff, which is very costly and very aggravating for everyone involved. So walk them through the proposed solution, solicit that feedback from them, and figure out if you're at least on the right track from a high level, right? So they haven't used it. We'll test for usability later, and I'll talk through that in the validating usability section. But right now, we just want to make sure we're on the right track. So this is just a temperature check of the users to make sure that, one, you've understood their problem, and two, that at a high level conceptually, you're attacking it the right way. Okay, so number 2 on that list for qualitative follow-ups is a shopping cart test. So I heard about this from, I don't remember who the PM was or what company they worked for. I remember it was a very smart lady who had been in product management for a long time, and she introduced this to me over a podcast. Okay, and she was explaining how she implemented this type of a test for a couple reasons. And what I remember her explaining is this is a very simplified way to break down prioritization in your mind and also in the user's mind, right? And like subconsciously they understand that through this method, they understand that you can't build everything and solve every problem. And so if you're trying to prioritize amongst a variety of problems, this helps not only you internally and your team internally see things in a more simplified view, but it also helps the user understand that resources are finite. So before I get into it, there's a couple times to use this test. So one of those times is whenever you're just trying to understand the level of desirability, right? Which is what we're doing now. Okay, so from a number of problems, let's say a user brought up many problems. Okay, um, you can use it to try to prioritize amongst the many problems the user described, or you can go back to the individual users and say, here's some problems that we've identified, um, and then present this to them. And I'll walk through what the test looks like in just a second. The other time is whenever you've identified maybe 2 or 3 problems that you feel like you're trying to decide which one do we execute on, or which 1 or 2 do we execute on, because all of them we feel really strongly that it could get us to our goal, but each problem is a little bit different. So going back to the RICE framework, right? So we have reach, impact, confidence, and effort. So what the dollar signs represent are effort. How expensive is implementing the solution to problem 1, 2, 3, or 4? Okay, and so I broke this down in terms of weeks. So you could put weeks on the end of this here too. So like 2 weeks. So each week cost you $10 basically, and your budget is $60. So in essence, you could solve problem 1 and 4. You could solve problem 4 and 2. You could solve problem 1 and 2, or you could solve problem 3. Those are different scenarios to be within your budget, or to have enough time to implement those different arrangement of problems that you could solve. All right, so I hope that makes sense, where you quantify in dollar value the cost of solving these problems, and you could do that monetarily or in weeks, but it just makes more sense. Like, people are more familiar with shopping and having a budget, right? So your budget is $60, timeline is 6 weeks, and you can kind of look at it from a monetary value or a weekly value. And you have the user tell you, and basically you frame it like this. Okay, so you go to the store, or you come to our product, and you could solve any of these problems, but you have $60 and you can only spend $60. How would you spend that money? And you could ask that different ways, but there's something psychological about this test and asking it this way, where users typically think at a more critical level, because they take some ownership of, like, okay, this is my $60. How would I spend my $60? And in reality, it's you as the company spending money to solve their problems. But whenever you flip the ownership back on them of saying, like, okay, you own the budget, how would you spend it? They give you some pretty telling answers for this. So it's a really fun test, and I'm really glad I learned about it through that podcast to add to my own product tool belt. And I hope you find this very useful as well. If you find yourself in the scenario where you're trying to prioritize amongst problems, and one of the things to note on this is you would need to already have had that conversation with your developers. In that previous section we talked about, in the section on diagrams and mockups, that conversation, I said that the reason you did that was have a conversation with your developers. Well, in that conversation, you're trying to gauge effort. And if you have an idea of what that effort is, then you can properly go about forming this shopping cart test. But it's really hard to quantify how much each of these solutions are going to cost unless you've already had that conversation with your developers. So I know in this project, you might not have direct access to the developers of these products. So take your best guess. You should know if something would be an easy solution, or if there may be some complexity to it. If you don't, send me an email, and I'll try to help break this down. The way I look at it is, like, if you're looking to make a simple change in the user interface, like rearranging where some things are in the visual, the UI, those are probably smaller things. Copy changes are pretty small things. So, like, changing the wording or how something is described in the product, those are pretty small changes. Whole new features are probably more costly. Things that require, like, database changes or architectural changes, are pretty expensive. So it just depends on the product, the scenario, and what you're looking to solve. That'll determine the effort, but really it's for a developer to decide. So yeah, with that, try out the shopping cart test. Again, it's a tool you could use. You don't have to use it, but I find it really telling if you have that information on the development effort involved, to where you can properly assess this. Okay, so enough of qualitative. Here's just a couple of ways that you can go back and try to gauge desirability on a qualitative level. Next, we're going to go to quantitative measures and different ways to do that. Remember, these are options. They're not the only options, and you don't have to use them. Based on your situation, use what you find relevant to you and what's going to help you drive to the right outcome, because that's what this is all about. So I'll see you in the quantitative section of validating desirability.